Welcome to another episode of First Off, Let's Kill All the Lawyers. I'm David Heffernan. I'm a South Florida lawyer. Been practicing law here for about 3 decades now. Um, and it's that oft-uttered phrase that Shakespeare wrote back in the 15th century that actually drew quite a bit of laughter when it was uttered. And even today, despite the fact that we all know it was an odd way to compliment lawyers, a lot of people think it's probably not a bad idea. Goal behind this podcast is simple: bring on some local and national lawyers, introduce them, get to know a little bit about them, and maybe one by one we can take them off the kill list. Well, this one's going to be easy to take off the kill list because my guest this morning is the office executive partner at White and Case, a truly international law firm with, I think, 45 offices in 31 countries. He's probably one of the top appellate lawyers in the country. And if I read just the accolades and the opinions and everything else, my show would be over. So we'll touch on some of those but Raoul Cantero, Raoul, pleasure to have you on this morning.
Thanks. It's great to be here, David. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, I'm looking forward to it because we talk about where you're at now, and again, just ultimate respect as to the level of your practice and everything else with a firm like White and Case. But I want to work backwards a little bit because you've had a fascinating journey, far from over, but a pretty fascinating journey that I think people will be interested in. So let's talk about first, what was the first interest that you had in getting into law?
Actually, it was in high school. I went to Christopher Columbus High School here in Miami, and I don't know what, yes, I don't know what class we were taking, but I was assigned to be the prosecutor, and there was somebody who was on the defense, and we argued back and forth, and I said, "Wow, this is cool." And my father had actually been in law enforcement in Cuba before we came over. And so I grew up literally reading Ian Fleming novels.
Okay.
When I was like 7, 8, 9 years old. I mean, that's before we had video games and everything. And that was my entertainment at night, was reading Ian Fleming novels and reading books on sharks and dolphins. So as high school developed, I started developing that interest. And one of the reasons I went to FSU for college was it was one of only two colleges in the country that had schools of criminology. And I thought at that time that I wanted to go through criminology before law school. And since I had a girlfriend I was serious with, I decided on FSU. Was the only school I applied to, because we thought we'd be pretty serious, and it worked out because we eventually got married and we're still married. So.
Well, that's always good to have the good story to it, because you hate to see a guy go to a certain school just for the girl, and then he dumps a girl in his freshman year, and
yes.
So it happens.
Yeah.
So you go on from Florida State, and we won't gloss over that. My daughter went to school there, so at least she didn't go to Florida. So
right.
You go to Florida State, and then you wind up going to Harvard for law school. Talk about how that came about.
Well, first, ironically, I never majored in criminology. When I was a freshman, sophomore, I started talking to some lawyer friends of my father who were advising me on things that I should study in preparation for law school. And they started talking to me about, mathematics, about the importance of writing and things like that. So I totally switched my major from criminology to English and business. And at FSU, you could co-major in English and business. And I took all the core courses in business, and in English, I focused on writing, which ended up helping me out a lot. And then I minored in math and philosophy, and it ended up almost inadvertently being a 4-year preparation for the LSAT. So you're asking me how I got into Harvard. It's really that 4 years of studying writing, mathematics, in the business side. In philosophy, I took a lot of logic courses, so that prepared me for the logic questions on the LSAT. And I was fortunate. I really focused in college on studying. I went into the honors programs and things like that, and I did my share of partying. But Monday through Friday, it was all business, studying and playing rugby on the side. So I was fortunate, because of my grades and my LSAT, to get into several of the good law schools. And Harvard was my choice because it was a bigger school. It offered more electives, and it was in a big city like Boston, as opposed to Yale, which was in a smaller town. And I had already lived in a small town in Tallahassee back then, a lot smaller than it is now. And so that was one of the factors involved.
All right. And then you go to Harvard, you graduate with honors, not surprising. You do very well there. You come back to Miami, working in an appellate practice at Adorno Yass. And then in 2002, you get appointed to the Florida Supreme Court by then Governor Bush. Talk about that process, how a guy who's practicing law, not on the bench, and then all of a sudden gets elevated to the highest court in the state.
Yeah, it was really, I would say, a dream come true, but I had never dreamt of going to the Florida Supreme Court. But it was really a progression that culminated in that, because after I clerked for a judge and we spent a year in Panama, came back, and Hank Adorno was a lawyer I had known from clerking at a couple of firms where he was a partner, and he had just formed, like 18 months earlier, a new firm where it was then called Adorno Yass, Adorno Allen Yass and Goodkind. Rather than go the big firm route, I decided, you know what, I'm going to go to this startup firm and help it grow. And I was the 13th attorney at that firm. Most of the litigation partners were all of them were former state prosecutors. So if you know anything about prosecutors, they love to go to court and argue. They hate to write.
Right.
And so I happened, having majored in writing and really developed a love for writing, I started getting the appeals. And as the firm grew, I became the go-to guy for appeals, just being in the right place at the right time. And the firm developed a commercial litigation department, an insurance defense department, a zoning and land use department, and even a criminal defense department. And all of those departments generated litigation, which then generated appeals. And they just gave me the appeals. So as the firm grew, by 2002, it was 150 lawyers from 13 when I had joined. Wow. I had done over 250 appeals and over 100 oral arguments at this firm, which, if you know anything about appeals, that's unheard of at a private firm. You usually only get that kind of experience in the public sector because private firms, they don't go to trial that often to generate that many appeals. But I was very fortunate also in Florida. It's one of the states that allows non-final review of a lot of orders. So there's more appellate work generated in Florida than in many other states. So that was the situation in 2002. Then Major Harding in April announced that he was going to be retiring in September. And that kind of set off a storm of speculation about who would apply and who would replace him. It was going to be a statewide seat. In Florida, there has to be one justice on the court from each of the 5 district courts of appeal. Because there was already a justice from the Jacksonville 1st DCA area, and Harding was from that area, this opening was going to be statewide. So it was open to anyone in the state.
Okay.
However, at that time, you had to move to Tallahassee if you wanted to be a justice. You had to move your family to Tallahassee. So that kind of limited the pool of applicants. So for this one position, there were 17 applicants from across the state, only 2 in Miami, me and one other judge. How I became an applicant, I had never thought of applying to the Supreme Court, but I started getting questions and prodded by members of my colleagues in the appellate community saying, hey, look, you should apply to this. You'd be great. The normal thing is for either a circuit court, a trial court judge to apply, or an appellate court judge to apply. That's kind of the normal progression. But there have been, and even at that time, there were 2 justices who had been lawyers and then went directly to the Supreme Court. So it wasn't unheard of at the time. So I approached my wife about it, and she immediately said, "No, there's no way I'm moving my family to Tallahassee." So I kind of, forgot about it, but then I started getting more and more questions about it, and really prodded to do it. And I went back and I said, what are we going to do? I keep getting asked. And she said, we decided, look, let's pray about it. Let's see, what's best, and really put it in God's hands. So that's what we did. We agreed that I would apply, and then, let the chips fall where they may. And if it was God's plan for us to move our family to Tallahassee, that's what we would do. So I decided to do it. I was one of 5 nominees to Governor Bush. So we had to go through a process. When you apply to an appellate position in Florida, there's a judicial nominating commission appointed. And it's a 9-member commission that you apply to. And that commission recommends anywhere from 3 to 6 of those applicants to the governor. And then the governor appoints from those 3 to 6 applicants. It's a lot different from the federal way of doing things, and frankly, it's a lot less. It becomes less political, although you can never take the politics out of judicial appointments completely. But it's a lot less political. In order to apply, you have to submit a really thick application with a lot of information, including, the attorneys that you've practiced against, the judges that you've practiced in front of, any ex-spouses that you have, believe it or not. So if you've made any enemies in your career, they're going to come out during the application.
Coming out during this process, right?
Yes. So I applied. I was fortunate enough to be one of the 5, and the other 4 were judges. 3 were appellate judges, and 1 was a circuit judge. And we all went to an interview before the governor. I remember very well, on July 1st, 2002, and on July 9th, we got a call at 6:30 in the morning or something like that. My wife puts me on the phone. It's Jeb Bush. And I said, yeah, right. It's probably your brother-in-law your brother playing a prank on me. But it was the governor. So he called me, said he was appointing me, and we flew up that day for the announcement the next morning.
That's fantastic. And I mean, just quite a story. And now we get to take great pride, because as a Columbus alumni, you were the first to serve, and now we have a current Columbus alumni sitting on the Supreme Court. So it's kind of nice, coming from that small school in Westchester.
That's right.
Let's talk about the process a little bit. You get there, and I don't think people really understand maybe how the decision-making process works. They see it on TV, and you're at a podium, and there's a panel of judges up there, but how does that whole decision-making, when a case gets up there, finally sort of come to fruition to get the ultimate decisions out?
Well, as a general matter, it's already been through the appellate process, unless that's a death penalty case where it goes directly from the trial up to us, and we actually make the decision the first instance. It usually goes through one of the district courts of appeal in Florida. They make a decision. Our jurisdiction is rather limited, so there has to be a jurisdictional hook for it to get to us. A lot of our jurisdiction is discretionary. So the first thing we get is briefs on jurisdiction telling us why we should take the case. A lot of it is based on conflict. If one district court decision conflicts with a decision of another district court of appeal in somewhere else in the state, that would be conflict jurisdiction. And one of the purposes of the Florida Supreme Court is to make sure that the law across the state is uniform. If there's not one rule in Jacksonville and another rule in Tampa and another rule in Fort Lauderdale. So we're there to make the law uniform. So one of the common hooks for getting us jurisdiction is that there's a conflict, but they have to demonstrate that there actually is a conflict in the 2 decisions that we need to resolve. So that's the first decision that has to be made, and that goes to a group of 5 justices. So not the entire 7-member bench, but just 5. However, 4 have to agree either to grant jurisdiction or deny it. If it's a 3-2 decision, one way or the other, then it goes to the other 2 justices to make sure that 4 justices are voting either to take the case or deny the case.
Okay.
But once we take the case and we decide, yeah, we're going to take the case, then we order briefing on the merits of the case. And then we have 3 briefs, the appellant or petitioner's brief, the respondent's brief, and then a reply brief by the petitioner. We get those briefs and we decide, are we going to have oral argument on this or not? A lot of cases are decided without oral argument, but about half the appeals are decided with oral argument. So let's say we decide to have oral argument. The briefs will now go to a specific chambers that's responsible for that case. So let's say it goes to my chambers and it's going to be argued 6 weeks hence. My chambers is then responsible for drafting a bench memorandum to all the justices explaining what the case is about, what the facts are, the legal analysis, and a recommendation. Now, the recommendation is, worth the paper it's written on, because the justices make up their minds, but at least we know, okay, what is this law clerk thinking and why is the law clerk thinking it? But it does have an independent analysis of the issues. So it's not depending on one side or the other to analyze the case. It looks at all the cases that are cited, reviews the record on appeal, and comes up with its own analysis. So that's sent out to all the justices. We get to oral argument in 6 weeks, and the parties only have 20 minutes per side to argue their case. So a case that may have taken 3 weeks of trial that's been pending for 6 years, there were 50-page briefs on both sides. It all comes down to 20 minutes of argument. And after that argument, we go back into, after that morning's arguments, rather, there's probably 4 arguments set for a particular day on 1 week out of every month. After that day's arguments, we'll go back into the conference room right behind the bench, and we'll go around the room, and the justice who's in charge of that case, in this example, me, I would start off the discussion and say, this is where I think we should go. This is what I'm thinking. And then we'd go around the room, and all the other justices in reverse order of seniority, or in order of seniority, except that the Chief Justice goes last, would give their opinion on the case. And many times, I'd be in the majority, and so I would be writing an opinion kind of like along the analysis that I had described. Sometimes, however, the person who's in charge of the case ends up being in the minority and actually has to, for the most part, write a majority opinion, and then is free to write the dissent if that justice wants to. But the chambers is responsible for writing the majority opinion, which is why you sometimes see per curiam as the author of the opinion, and then a dissent by a particular justice. A lot of times that indicates that justice was the chambers wrote the opinion.
That's fascinating. I didn't realize that yeah, if it was assigned to you, and even now that you may not agree with it, you've still got to write the opinion because that's what the majority came up with.
Yeah. And there are a few rare times when the justice says, look, I can't write this because I have no idea how I would write the majority. I think this is ridiculous. That doesn't happen very often because the cases that come up to the Supreme Court are, for the most part, close calls. They come up on a conflict because 3 different judges from one panel have disagreed with 3 judges from another panel in the state on a particular question of law. And so, it's not necessarily intuitive what the result is. And so you can generally argue both sides of the case. So it doesn't happen very often that a justice will say, there's no way I could write the majority here.
Well, I was fortunate enough to have the privilege to argue before the Supreme Court, Florida Supreme Court. And ironically, you weren't on the bench, but you were actually there for oral argument as well.
Yes.
So by then you had already left the bench. But talk about that a little bit. You talk about sort of the initial assessment being done. How often do people change their minds based on the discussions. I guess the question really is, how open-minded can you stay on this? And when you get into these discussions with just the 7 justices, I mean, how dispassionate are these? How often do you see people flip back and forth?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it really depends on the personality of the justice or the judge. And I've sat on judicial nominating commissions myself, and that's one of the questions I ask is, how open are you to hear other viewpoints in that conference room? Because I think it's very important and it's part of the collective decision-making process. So I try to keep a very open mind. There are cases where this is the way you go because your judicial philosophy dictates that you go a certain way, or your previous opinions on cases dictate that you be consistent with yourself and go a certain way. But a lot of the cases are you could go either way, and you really want to hear other people's opinions. And sometimes, or a lot of times, leaving the argument, we're still not sure how we're going to rule, and it's only in that collective discussion that you come to a conclusion. And even then, it's only tentative. We always have the right, after we made a tentative decision at the conference, to ask for the case to be reconferenced because you're having trouble writing an opinion and you're not sure still which way to go and you want to talk about it again. So that can get scheduled for another conference. And I actually had a case where I was the author of the opinion, and I wanted to go a certain way, and I had a majority for that position, but it was a 4-3 majority. So it was a very close call. I get back to my chambers working on the opinion with my law clerks, and I said, you know what? The other 3 people are right. And I ended up changing my mind and writing a majority opinion, but writing it for the other side. And so sometimes the calls are just that close. There's no law on point. That's what we're there to do a lot of times, decide issues of first impression. So they're very difficult sometimes to resolve. And at least I wanted as much input as possible. And, we know where the lawyers are coming from. The lawyers have a position staked out. They are advocating for their side. So we take what they say with a grain of salt, but your colleagues are more objective. And so you listen to them more. You say, you know what, maybe that's a good point. So I always try to be very open to other points of view, even after oral argument. The justice who had the office adjacent to me was Barbara Pariente, and we were on opposite sides of a lot of cases. I dissented on her cases, she would dissent on my cases, but we always kept a line of communication, and she would feel free to come into my office to discuss a case. I would go into her office to discuss a case, and a lot of times we were able to resolve our differences, or one person would convince the other of the position. So, and we really enjoyed that intellectual exchange. It didn't happen among everybody on the court, but when you find somebody like that that's interested in that discourse and really trying to reach the right result, it's very exciting.
Well, it's an exciting process, particularly in today's society where we've got so much divisiveness, to hear about a sort of collaborative process where people can agree to disagree, where people can put down their thoughts and listen and take in new thoughts. I mean, it's how the system's designed to work. And so it's fascinating to hear. Yeah. Was there any particular case or type of case that really intrigued you most while you served on the Florida Supreme Court?
Well, actually, I really enjoyed deciding the non-death penalty criminal cases because I hadn't done much criminal law as a lawyer, and a lot of the criminal cases raised issues of first impression because we're interpreting a new statute or a new rule or a new case from the United States Supreme Court. A lot of them involved constitutional issues that had never come up, or the application of some new constitutional decision from the Supreme Court. So a lot of those were very exciting. Then you had the ones that were very public, and we knew that the public was watching this very closely. The one that stands out the most to me was the Terry Schiavo cases. Sure. Which you may remember, she was on life support, and her husband said that she had told him that she would want to be taken off life support if that ever happened. Her parents said no. She told us that she would not want to be taken off life support. And so in that case, a judge had reconciled that conflicting testimony and had decided that the husband was right and that she would have wanted to be taken out of life support. So that went up to the District Court of Appeal. We didn't decide that case, but what happened later was the legislature drafted a law to prohibit her from being taken off life support. That's the case that came up to us. And the issue was whether that law, which applied only to Terry Schiavo's case, violated the separation of powers, and whether the legislature had the authority to essentially change the result in one case, not for the future, but for that particular case. And so there were all kinds of questions whether that was an ex post facto law, whether it violated separation of powers. So we knew that was a very important case, and it was being watched nationally.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But when we got down to it, the legal questions were really not that hard. We agreed unanimously that that law violated the separation of powers. And we thought it was important to issue a unanimous opinion if we could, if we all felt the same way. And so we did. And so I thought that was an instance of the court getting together, taking the politics out of it, taking the white noise out of it, and just focusing on the legal issues and coming up with what we thought was the required result, no matter how we thought, one way or the other on the moral issue.
Right. And I guess that's the difficult part now is you've got to set that aside to say, we've got to analyze the legal aspect of this. And it's also a great demonstration of the balance between the powers. This is why we have the court and legislate. Everybody's got to play their role. And if somebody's overstepping their bounds, hopefully that stays balanced within it somehow.
Yeah. And if it's one thing I learned as a justice and as an appellate lawyer now is that a lot of the public really doesn't understand that procedure, and the media does a terrible job of trying to make them understand the procedure and the law involved. All the media cares about, and a lot of politicians and the public, is what was the result in that case? And do I like the result? If I don't like the result, they must have been wrong. Without looking at the underlying reasons for that result and why that result was required. And so whenever I get calls from the media saying, hey, I'd like you to opine on this Supreme Court case that was just released, what do you think about it? And I said, I can't tell you anything until I read the case. I actually have to read what they say before I know what they did. I know what the result was.
Right.
But I don't know what I think about it because I don't know what the reasoning behind the result was.
Well, unfortunately, we live more and more in a society of sound bites and just this little grab that you can take out of it, and then and it distorts the whole picture of what it is. And I know, because you obviously take great pride in your writing. Also read you actually do some writing on your own, some fiction stuff, some short story stuff. So I know it's got to kill you because it kills me in the world of emojis and abbreviations and all of that, because the English language seems to be getting obliterated as we go through these things in social media.
No, absolutely. And I tell lawyers when they come in, when lawyers come in the office, I give them The Elements of Style by Strunk and White, and I give them another book called Thinking Like a Writer. It's a book for lawyers, but it's called Thinking Like a Writer. And whenever I get the chance, I tell lawyers that there's two problems with lawyers. The first problem is they don't know how to write.
Right.
The second problem is they think they do. And so if you think you know how to write, then you're never going to try to learn to write better. And so that's what I try to instill. And what I did, even after I became a lawyer, I had majored in writing, but my entire career, even now, I read books on legal writing so I can hone my skills, so I can remember maybe things that I had forgotten, because the writing aspect is so important. As I told you before, a lot of cases are decided without oral argument. So the only thing that the judges have to decide your case is your 1 or 2 briefs filed. So those briefs have to be as good as you can make them.
Absolutely. Listen, I could talk to you for hours and hours because it's fascinating. We've only touched on part of what you've done. We haven't got back to to what you do at White and Case now. And you know, we'll have to follow up on this some other time, but I really appreciate you coming on, sort of educating myself and others on the process of the Florida Supreme Court. And I think it's a fascinating story of the kid from Westchester who, you know, gets out through Florida State, Harvard with graduate. And I didn't even touch on that you were a Fulbright scholar, which is astonishing. Okay. That could be a whole nother show. But anyway, enough there. I think that we can take Raoul Cantero off the kill list. He's one of the good ones. One of the good ones, extraordinarily well respected. And I'm fortunate to call you a friend as well. Raoul, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. It's great talking to you. Thanks for having me.
You got it. All right. That's it. Join us next week for another episode of First Off, Let's Kill All the Lawyers.